New atheism is dead. Hi, I'm Brit Hartley, atheist spiritual director with a master's degree in theology, and today we are having a funeral for new atheism because as someone who rode that wave, it seems like the narrative has shifted and that the social phenomenon of new atheism is dead, even though, of course, atheism is far older than this recent uptick. So these are the 10 reasons that I think that new atheism is dead, and I'll let you know at the end the chapter that I think we are in now. So number one, some of it died with Christopher Hitchens, and I just think that that is true. There was nothing more exciting than 15 years ago listening to Hitch just wipe the floor with anyone brave enough to go against him. In my mind, he didn't lose a single debate. There was no match for his intellectualism. There was no match for his understanding of literature and history and theology. He had in his brain on call at any moment that he could recite. And a lot of new atheism was on the coattails of this big, controversial personality who was just incredibly smart and witty and just drew us all in. And in some ways, when he died, new atheism died with it. None of the other new atheists were anywhere near as charismatic or controversial or exciting to watch. We have Hitch slaps, but we don't really have Dawkins slaps or Harris slaps. And it's just not the same without Hitch.
Tell a child, you go to this church, which means you'll go to heaven, but your little playmates don't go to that church and therefore will go to hell. Seems to me to be an unpleasant thing to be saying. But
yes, that is.
Maybe I'm in a minority then.
That could be an unpleasant thing, but how do you develop?
Actually, an evil thing.
Let's call it evil, Christopher.
Something that only a religious person would dream of saying.
Let's call it evil. Where does evil come from?
Religion.
Number two, poverty of new arguments. Alex O'Connor recently discussed this because atheism really isn't a worldview or a philosophy. It's simply a negation of theistic claims. And so there's really nothing new to say that hasn't already been said. Books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins or God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens laid out a clear critique of religious dogma, often focusing on logical inconsistencies and lack of evidence, the harm caused by organized religion. However, these arguments have not significantly evolved, and most of what new atheism has to say has been heard and absorbed and digested by the people who were willing to listen to it. And so there's not really more to say. We don't get a lot of new arguments as to why this particular God isn't more real than any of the other gods. I would say that since the God delusion and since God is not great, really the only new arguments that we're getting for atheism really come from psychology and neuroscience and understanding more psychologically why we create religions, why we're afraid of death and meaninglessness, why we want eternal justice in a world that's not fair. We understand more of that now as we study existential fears and do studies on what we humans do when we're reminded of death, things like terror management studies. And so we have more human brain arguments that negate the idea that God creates us, and so it supports the idea that we create gods. But other than kind of some of that going on in psychology and neuroscience, the rest of the arguments are generally the same as they've ever been. And so it's been said, it's been done. There's not really a lot more to say about it. Number three, religious affiliation is already declining now for various reasons. So the younger generations need less convincing because they weren't raised with as many ties to traditional religious institutions. In the United States, for example, the rise of nuns, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated, has been steadily increasing, especially with millennials and Gen Z. And this shift reduces the need for aggressive arguments against religious belief because fewer people are being raised in strict religious ideologies. So when Christopher Hitchens was a kid, he went to Christian boarding school where everyone was sort of being indoctrinated into it. And that's just not the case for kids today. And so there's less to deconstruct. If you take your average Gen Z kid and say, hey, I think religion can be abusive, and I'm not sure that this particular God is real, Gen Z is like, yeah, we know that. Like they're already on board with that. Number four, militancy became less appealing. There's this shift that happened in the cultural lexicon where atheist began to mean militant atheist, like this was your personality. You watched all the YouTube debates. If someone asked what you were into or something, you would say, I'm an atheist. And you like to be one of the people at parties to be like, actually, blah, 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 blah. And people got annoyed by that over time.
Around here, Oscar is known as Actually, because he will insert himself into just about any conversation to add facts or correct grammar.
Actually, you're speculating.
And so, what I see a lot of atheists do now is that they'll just call themselves agnostic, even though that's answering a totally different question. Because agnostic today means something conversationally like soft atheism, or I'm an atheist, but I'm too tired to fight about it, and I'm not going to be a jerk about it. So, technically, if you're not a theist, meaning you've looked at the arguments of a theistic God, a personal creator God who intercedes on the behalf of humans and answers prayers, if you are not convinced of that God, you are an atheist. Agnosticism is a separate question. It's an epistemological question about whether or not we have enough information to be asking this question. So technically all agnostics are atheists because you're not convinced of a theistic God. But these words change and the baggage around them changes based on a modern conversation. So what I see today is less people making their identity around being an atheist, which is, I think, a good thing, and people more saying I'm agnostic because they don't want to be the douchebag atheist that dies on the hill of defending their lack of beliefs. Number 5, what is the point of truth? This one is more subtle, but I think it's really pertinent. Let's just say that someone is convinced of atheism. They listen to Hitch and Harris and Dawkins and Dennett and they lose their faith. Not uncommon. It's a totally normal thing to happen, even in pastor and apologist circles. Then there's this shift into, okay, what's the point? What is the point of being right? What is the point of truth if it makes life harder? And some people will say their life is just fine as an atheist and it's better than when it was in religion, and I get that. But there's also a lot of people who say they can't believe anymore, but they aren't really they aren't really thriving. Secularism doesn't offer community the same way that religion can. Leaving religion, this thing that we co-evolved with that has tools to help us, can feel like the right thing to do because you can't believe, but then you actually have to face death. And you have to face meaninglessness. And now you have kids, and kids benefit from things like order and structure and mentors and story and rites of passage and rituals and community and identity and belonging. And some of these things just aren't found easily in society. We even have some evidence that shows that sometimes ignorance is bliss. Sometimes your delusions are a much better life than the reality, which is you're going to suffer and die and the universe doesn't give a shit and you're going to be forgotten. Like, there's a reason that we co-evolved with religion, because we function better with religion, especially when we became smart enough to realize that we were going to die. So even if atheism is right, if it makes you more miserable, more isolated from your family, gives you less tools and resources, and now you have existential depression and anxiety and can't get out of bed because what is the point? I even know some atheists struggling with nihilism who wish that they still believed in God, even though they don't think that God exists. It's like that part of Inception where the people are in the dream world and they ask the guide, do they come here to go to sleep? And he says, no, they come here to wake up because their dream world is far better than actual reality. Which leads me to my next point. Number 6, the conversation has shifted to whether or not religion is good for you. There's this growing acknowledgement among atheists and secularists of the social and psychological functions that religion can play. And this doesn't mean agreeing with religious doctrines, but it does recognize that religious communities can offer emotional support and moral frameworks and social connections. And so the conversation 20 years ago, especially after 9/11, where we were talking about the dangers of fundamentalism or whether or not God exists or whether or not the Quran is true, whether or not the Bible is true, I think that new atheists did very well in those debates. And there are still those debates going on, such as recently Alex O'Connor just embarrassed Dinesh D'Souza. And it was like watching a fight where like one guy is 100 pounds stronger than the other guy, just like beating the shit out of the little guy to the point where you feel bad and you're like, Jesus, somebody call this thing. Here's one clip from that.
The scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. That is much later than the sun. The Old Testament account, the Hebrew Bible account, tells us that it was the other way around. So it got that bit wrong.
All right. So we're, yes, The Bible is not.
So sometimes it gets things right,
No.
sometimes it gets things wrong, you know?
The Bible is not
It's
a
not that
science.
astounding to me.
It's not listing out a scientific.
Well, now hold on a second. You can't now move the goalpost, especially if you're still gonna miss.
The
doing
issue.
so.
The issue of the origin of the universe is extremely critical.
You just told me that Genesis predicted, or knew about, or somehow knew about the scientific hypothesis of the origin of the universe. Then, when I pointed out another scientific observation that doesn't accord with Genesis, you tell me that Genesis isn't a scientific text to begin with.
Well, if you read Genesis, it is making a astounding claim, which pertains to God. Obviously, God created the heavens and the earth.
Is it making a scientific claim or not? Is it telling us how the universe scientifically formed or not?
It's not telling us how the universe scientifically formed, because if it did, they would be outlining the history of the Big Bang.
Then what's the relevance of bringing this up in the first place?
Because it is stating a conclusion, not a process. It's not telling you how the universe was formed.
Right.
It's not telling you about...
It also doesn't tell us how the sun was formed, but it tells us that it was formed after the earth was. It tells us that that's the case. That's wrong. It's incorrect.
Show me.
So these debates still do happen, but the conversation has shifted more towards, is religion good for you? That's the conversation now. The conversation between theists and atheists has really died down. So whether or not God exists, or if you can prove one holy book or another, isn't really the focus. The focus is, in light of the rise of nihilism, where people are struggling with the meaninglessness of it all, the rise of depression and anxiety, the lack of meaning, the suicidality of younger generations, now the conversation is religion good for you? Because there's far more evidence for that is compelling than evidence for a particular God and a particular magical book. So we have some evidence that shows that people who had religion fared better than those who didn't over COVID. We have some evidence that shows that sometimes ignorance is bliss. Sometimes philosophy actually makes you more depressed and anxious because you're more aware. We have evidence that shows that children are in great need of the tools that religious communities offer. I know full-on atheists who take their kids to Catholic school and they try to soften it a little because they feel like it's a better school with more order and structure and emphasis on moral education that they can't get anywhere else. So while I think New Atheists did their job in pointing out how difficult it is to rationally justify belief in one God when we create so many, and there's no reason to think that the God of Mesopotamian mythology is the god any more than there's reason to believe that Zeus existed. And so I do think that atheists come out on top in those debates, but the debate now is far more nuanced, where we have to ask, okay, but is religion good for us? What are the reasons that we co-evolved with religion? And if it is good for us, then the best thing that we need to do is actually shift these religious institutions in what we need religion to be now in society. We need it for moral education. We need it for third spaces, somewhere that isn't home or work. We need it for soup kitchens and community outreach. We need to have a place to hold on to the sacred, have some place in society to talk about that and reach for that and have stories about that. So currently, the best arguments for religion are not based on the fact that you can prove that this God is real. It's based on the idea that humans have co-evolved with religion, just as Daniel Dennett says that we have co-evolved with music, and perhaps we can co-evolve with religions in ways that are good for humans now. And if I were debating that side, I could put up a serious argument in a serious debate, whereas trying to defend God and magic books are much more easily dismissed. Number 7, a desire to hold on to cultural Christianity. Something that atheists are more aware of is that there are far worse ideologies in this world than Christianity. And if we lose culture, it makes us so hungry and it creates such a vacuum that worse things can take its place. We're seeing a rise in Islam. We're seeing a rise in fundamentalism as religions are threatened. We're seeing a rise in nihilism, and we're seeing a rise in political religions. And Nietzsche warned us about this. He warned us about the vacuum of the death of God, and that we will continue to find the shadows of God for a long time, even after we accept that God is dead. So now, instead of Richard Dawkins going on tour for his book, The God Delusion, now he's talking about being a cultural Christian. He's talking to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the 5th member of the New Atheist movement, who's rubbed shoulders with all of these guys who went from being an ex-Muslim atheist to being Christian. And when you read her original statement, it wasn't like, oh, I had this like Paul conversion experience and now I know that Jesus is my savior. She didn't say any of that. She said, I'm looking at the rise of Islam, political religions, the rise of the woke mob of the left, and the only way I see for us to combat this is Christianity. And so essentially she looked into the void, looked at the things currently filling the void and said, hey guys, Christianity is our best bet here. And she's hoping that the good things from cultural Christianity will eventually help her to have faith in the big things, in the truth claims, even though that's really not natural to her right now. And so, quietly in atheist circles, there can be this sense of knowing that when people lose God, they're more likely to throw themselves into a political religion or a political demagogue, more likely to fall prey to fundamentalism that says this is the truth. And if you're lost, this is the way. And so then atheists are more gentle about wanting to burn it all down because the ones who are paying attention know that there are monsters around the corner. Number 8, a desire for the sacred. There are many atheists, including myself, who are still inspired by historical Jesus, not the Jesus we see from, the Republican National Party, the homeless radical Jew before they made a god out of him, the one who flipped tables of the institution, who went into the wilderness outside of the institution for his baptism, who spoke against the evils of wealth and power and gave voice to the poor and the marginalized, who focused on the heart of the law and a different way to be, like many other mystic teachers. I've studied Jesus now for 20 years with Christian mystics, with professors, with apologists, and there is still something interesting about these parables, something profound. It's interesting to watch the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, where young men who usually wouldn't go to church will watch a 2-hour YouTube video on the story of Cain and Abel or the story of Abraham. Now, I would argue that Jordan Peterson, if I were to be an armchair psychologist for a second, he has a deep fear of nihilism. He knows what happens in the death of God. He said in the Sam Harris debates that he fears nihilism as Harris fears fundamentalism. There's a reason that Gabor says that he sees a lot of repressed rage in Peterson. He's got some demons. There's a reason that he got addicted to benzos, or why he studies the Holocaust and authoritarian dictators and nihilism. But what that did for JP is, rather than just say, hey, there's some value in these religious stories, he fears that if you lose the belief in these stories, you lose the value too, which is why he says things like, I act as if I believe in God. Because for him, holding on to belief in God is the way that he holds on to the values in these stories, and in that way he avoids his deepest fear, which is nihilism and the void and his demons, essentially. So recently in the Dawkins and Peterson debate/conversation moderated by Alex O'Connor, we saw the weaknesses in both sides. It is painful to try to get Peterson to answer the question of, did this really happen? He squirms a lot. He does this 30-minute word salad. What does it mean by happen? But it's because Peterson is trying to show Dawkins that, yeah, maybe a human named Cain and Abel did exist, maybe not. But can you see that there's value in this story? Can you see why this story would be passed campfire to campfire for thousands of years, and the archetypes that underlie this human story that allow it to be so captivating? And essentially, Dawkins says multiple times in the conversation, I don't care. I don't give a shit. I just care about the truth. And from Dawkins, when JP asks, hey, can you rate like books of fiction based on their level of truth, like the truth that they have about the human experience, like Dostoevsky, Lord of the Rings would be on the top, other books would be on the bottom. And Dawkins says, I can't really do that. And so JP can't say that these stories probably didn't literally happen, but the stories have meaning and value. And Dawkins can't say, he can't fully say that there's real value in these stories and that some fiction is more true than others. And so when you scroll through the comments of this debate, it's essentially like we want something to bridge the gap. Alex O'Connor said in the debate he felt like he was the corpus callosum connecting the right and left half of the brain, the symbolic, allegorical, artistic part of the brain and the logical part of the brain. And all this boils down to my point, which is, how do we rescue the sacred out of religion? Because some of these stories are compelling, and Jesus and Buddha are very interesting people, and they are pointing to a different way of being. And there's so much wisdom in these houses of religion that we want to be careful not to destroy them, because we may destroy with it a sense of the sacred. And so I think Jordan Peterson is trying to do that. I think he's probably the loudest proponent of that, but he's doing it in a way where he's having to hold on to the literal beliefs. And he's saying things about the Bible when he's not a Bible scholar that are just flat out wrong, that almost does damage to his own cause, because we can't take him seriously when Bible scholarship says that Moses isn't a real person, but he's over here doing all this Jungian archetype work with the Exodus story without admitting that this is just a story. But still, the point is, there is this growing conversation between atheists wanting to rescue the sacred out of religion. People like Nick Jenkel, who wrote The Spiritual Atheist. How can we rescue the sacred from the house that it's been protected in, which is the house of religion? All right, number 9. The rise of spiritual but not religious movements. So, New Atheism came out in a time when religious belief was a dominant paradigm, but now religious affiliation is in the decline, and we've seen the growth of alternative, non religious spiritual practices. Meditation, yoga, mindfulness, astrology, Wiccans, pagans, all this has surged in popularity, especially after COVID, among secular people who are searching for meaning and grounding, and particularly women. So, this shift reflects a broader desire for practices that address spiritual and existential needs without requiring belief in a deity at all. So, atheism doesn't really have anything to say about this. It doesn't have anything to say about crystals or manifesting or using pendulums, because atheism technically is whether or not we believe or have reason to believe in a theistic God. And so, what we need more of today is not Christopher Hitchens' God is not great, but something else. Like, if you wanted to be anti supernatural, you wouldn't just need atheism, you would need a lot of other things too. Because spirituality is now more complex than just a theistic God. So, for example, the other day I was on a podcast where we were both atheists, but he was super into astrology. And I'm as tough on astrology as I am on religion, but it requires different arguments than the new atheist movement, because now we're getting into things like brain biases. Astrology requires certain brain biases in order to work, like the hindsight bias, where it always fits the pattern in hindsight, or the Barnum effect, where if you ask people, hey, do you sometimes like credit for what you do, but sometimes you like to be behind the scenes? And people are like, oh my God, that's me. That's the Barnum effect. And we call it the Barnum effect because P.T. Barnum says that there's a sucker born every minute. So, to combat the rise of supernaturalism isn't just on one front in theistic religion. Now it's on multiple fronts because of various superstitions, various spiritual paths from a variety of places. So, I know atheists who believe in reincarnation, for example, or do past life work, but just reject the God of theism. So, new atheist arguments aren't really reflecting where the supernatural is happening today with the kids, because it's more about occult practices and crystals over them actually knowing what's in the Bible. Gen Z, when we look at polls and studies, they don't have the foggiest idea what's in the Bible. The language and the attention span, to be honest, between them and the Bible is just too great. So rather than focusing on new atheism, now we're talking about the line between where is good psychology and where is woo-woo. That's more of the modern conversation. Number 10, and last but not least, the realization that atheism is a privilege. One of the more complex realizations of the decline of new atheism is the acknowledgement that atheism itself can be a privilege that you just can't force on other people. In societies where religious beliefs are not forced on individuals, where secularism is respected, and where my safety and comfort is reasonably assured, I can afford to question the existence of God and reject traditional beliefs. I can get married under non-religious language because in that wedding ceremony, my friends and family would still show up. There are a lot of options for especially white educated people in first world countries to find resources outside of a religious group. This luxury of questioning does not always extend to societies where religion and faith are inseparably woven together in culture and even survival. So for those living under authoritarian regimes or deeply conservative or impoverished communities, religion is just not dogma, but it's hope and meaning, and sometimes social and material support as well, that you can't just throw away. And so rejecting belief in those contexts can carry severe risks, from ostracism and persecution and imprisonment to even death. And in more secular and prosperous societies, the material and social safety nets provide alternative sources of support, allowing us to explore non-religious worldviews. The privilege of atheism can be closely tied to class and geographical context, as those with resources and education often have more freedom to explore secular options without jeopardizing their well-being or social networks. And so for some, leaving religion might mean losing access to community or charity or education. And despite their flaws, religious institutions often fill the gaps left in by inadequate secular support systems. So the decline of new atheism then reflects a broader understanding that leaving religion is not a universal path. It's one that many people cannot afford due to their social and economic constraints. And so it's somewhat hypocritical to, for example, walk into a Black church on Sunday, where this community got through the horrors of slavery together as a people with faith in restoration theology, that someday God would return and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And so, am I going to walk in there with all of my white privilege and my white girl education and say, you're wrong and superstitious and your God isn't coming? Like, I'm not going to lie, but there is something kind of privileged about that and icky about that, that we're beginning to understand more and more and be sensitive to. And so, this realization has led many former new atheists to soften their rhetoric and reconsider the role that religion still plays in providing a sense of community and resilience for millions of people. So recognizing that atheism is a privilege doesn't invalidate atheism. I wish everyone was so privileged, but it does suggest that pushing for a secular worldview without sensitivity to things like social structures can be really short-sighted and really naive. The movement's earlier emphasis on like waking people up to atheism has evolved into a more nuanced awareness that the journey away from religion, if taken at all, requires a more supportive and compassionate approach, one that is aware of the costs as well as the benefits. So I think that new atheism is dead. If I were to be a historian and put a timestamp on it, I would say from 9/11 to about the time, maybe like a couple years after the death of Christopher Hitchens. So what chapter are we in now? We are in the meaning crisis chapter, the vacuum of the death of God. The question now isn't about trying to prove one God over another. It's what is the point? That is the quiet message underneath everything right now. We know capitalism in some ways really hurts us. We can't afford to live. Is it unethical to bring children into this world? If we just suffer and die, what is the point of this? People are scared and sense nihilism. And there's this growth of political nationalism and Trump-like characters and bullies that help people feel safe. There's a rise in fundamentalism as young people who have no sense of purpose or identity don't know what to do, and they get taken in by the confidence of one cult or another. This is the meaning crisis. And my best hope for this, even though we may not truly survive the death of God, we've never had a society without shared myths. We don't know the full dangers of, full-on nihilism. The hope is that these are growing pains. The hope is that if we can accept that we're going to die and God isn't coming to save us, perhaps that can be a catalyst to create life on earth more enjoyable for more people at the level of experience and human thriving. Perhaps if necessity is the mother of invention, maybe we can look back in future history and say, yeah, that was a meaning crisis in the West and it was not good. But from that, we built in things in society that we needed and we changed things. It's possible. Or we co-evolved with religion and for a reason, and the death of God will have us collapsing in on ourselves like a dying star. Either way, I'll be here to watch it. What I can say is that even though maybe I don't have a lot of hope that society is doing well in the meaning crisis, I do think that individuals can create lives of meaning. That I'm sure of. That I've seen. People who become like Sisyphus, who found himself happy even though pushing the rock up the hill is ultimately meaningless. Or to become something like the Overman or the Ubermensch, something more than a man who lives according to their own values to create a life of meaning, even just at the level of experience. The good things that come from religion, ritual, contemplation, awe, community, love, the sacred, order, structure, morality, education, inspiration, art, etc. Individuals can recreate that in their own lives and even create small communities of similarly minded people. Perhaps there will always be a matrix in a wilderness. Maybe that's an aspect of human nature that we can't stop. But I do think in this meaning crisis that change isn't going to come from the top down, because those movements require money and power, and you only get that from being a cult or dogmatic in some way. The movement to make peace with the meaning crisis has to come from the bottom up, from the level of the individual up. So for more on how to do that, check out my book, No Nonsense Spirituality, All the Tools, No Faith Required, and my courses on nihilism and secular spirituality. And I'll be here next Monday to do a video on what secular spirituality is and why I think it's the best option we have for moving forward in the meaning crisis without requirement of any delusion or any supernatural story to get there. So stay tuned for next week.